Hello, greetings all. Welcome to another edition of Ask Me Anything, live Q&A satsang, spontaneous, unplanned, unrehearsed. I often don't even get time to read the questions in advance, so it really is quite spontaneous. And there's no guarantee, of course, I can answer all the questions. The phrase ask me anything doesn't mean to imply that I can answer anything and everything. It simply states that you can ask anything. Answers may or may not be forthcoming. Even somebody who's studied many years in this and related fields still can't answer all the questions, of course. So just to be clear, feel free to ask anything. Yeah, I won't always have the answers. So, hello. Nice to be with you. Let's dive right into some of these questions. Hello. So, Jana or Jana, I think from Czech Republic, wrote in to ask about the 6 yogas of Naropa and whether there are indeed parallel practices in Śaiva Tantra or Shakta Śaiva Tantra. And the answer is yes, there are parallel practices. Not exactly the same, but it really depends on who's interpreting these 6 yogas, how they're interpreted. I mean, of course, there are interpretations that are totally standardized in Tibetan Buddhism, but that standardization should not suggest to us that other interpretations are not possible when we're talking about very esoteric practices that were revealed or propagated, 1,000 years ago. Naropa lived at the same time as Abhinavagupta, the greatest of all Shaiva Tantric masters, exactly the same time, basically. He was the guru of Naropa and lived around the year 1000. But just like Abhinavagupta, Naropa was not a revealer of brand new innovative practices. He was a kind of systematizer. He did reveal some stuff, right? But those 6 yogas of Naropa shouldn't be taken to imply he invented them or something like that. Rather than, he crystallized them in a more effective way. So just to run through them, and I'm not sure I completely understand the Buddhist interpretation of these practices. So, but it's clear enough that most of them have parallels on the Shaiva side. So, inner heat or tumo practice that has parallels, but to what degree it's the same practice, I think that's very much open to debate. Kurt Koitzer, who's a member of the group, would be certainly better qualified to comment on that than I am, because he's studied the Tibetan side of the Tantric tradition much more than I have. Illusory body, realizing the sort of emptiness or ephemerality and insubstantiality of the physical body, and realizing essence nature as a light body, as a body of light, is certainly very central to Shaiva Tantric practice. Clear light, luminosity practice, also central to or very significant anyway in Shaiva Tantric yoga. Dream yoga, less central. Certainly dream yoga seems to be more important in the Buddhist side of things, but it is also present in Shaiva Tantra. Poa is an adaptation of a Shaiva Tantric practice called Utkranti. So definitely that not only has a parallel, but the Buddhist practice is sourced from the Shaiva one. And then Bardo, well, I can't claim any kind of clear knowledge of exactly what the Buddhist Tantrikas mean by Bardo practices, the sixth of the six yogas. But I would suspect that those two have their Shaiva parallels. Anyway, that question wasn't in the official question thread. That came in through PM, and it's a big topic, but just briefly addressing it. Okay, from the question thread, Sarah and Beka talk about the issue of boundaries, having clear boundaries. And so just rattle off some phrases here that they use about the tendency to fawn, that is to misprioritize being liked over being respected and having clear boundaries, especially when stressed or overwhelmed, right? And of course, further research on complex PTSD has shown that fawn is one of the survival strategies. And the reason that fawn is used, that word, is just to make it another F, because we already had fight, flight, and freeze. And so fawn is another survival strategy when there's trauma in the system. And it doesn't, it looks very different, of course, from fight, flight, or freeze. But it is similarly an adaptation to a traumatized nervous system, which, of course, many, if not most people have to one degree or another. Anyway, so there's this talk here about trying to embody strong boundaries. And Beka adds how to correlate this with being loving to all people, while at the same time needing to not put up with manipulation and being taken advantage of. And she says, it's hard being vulnerable and loving while at the same time needing to protect the self as well from those who cause harm. Well, okay, first of all, the fact that this question is almost always asked by women and almost never asked by men itself is telling, because it shows us right off the bat that a lot of this has to do with sociocultural conditioning. Right? So this apparent conflict between being loving and asserting clear boundaries, that's not a real conflict. That's a socially conditioned conflict, right? It's a socially inculcated conflict. And to be honest, I'm not really the best person to ask about this, because I just don't, and maybe it's just because of my conditioning, but I just don't see this conflict between being loving and having clear boundaries. To me, it's like an invisible problem, because I just feel inclined to say, what do you mean? Be loving and have clear boundaries. There's no contradiction whatsoever, except the contradiction you make in your mind. Now, making a contradiction in your mind, again, is a result of your social conditioning. It's not your fault that you're making that contradiction. But I think I feel on firm ground in saying there really is no contradiction, but I don't feel on firm ground in guiding anyone into how to realize that. If you want to realize the truth about something, my strongest recommendation is to obsess over it for a while, right? To just start from the axiom, there is no conflict between being loving and asserting clear boundaries. Okay, now, how do I enact that truth? Every single day, bringing attention to it every single day, maybe multiple times a day. If you want to shift your paradigm and abide in truth instead of dysfunctional conditioning, you must make it a beneficial obsession for some period of time. right? So I think people really underestimate or don't even know about the role of obsession on the spiritual path, right? You've got to really, really drill down and focus on something intensively for a few months to make a paradigm shift that is permanent, okay? So 6 months is like a default value. Why? Because anything that is focused on for 6 months, neurologists and cognitive scientists tell us can become a permanent part of your knowledge base and your behavior, you know. But just kind of thinking about it a little bit is not going to do it. You need to repeatedly bring attention to it. And maybe it doesn't take 6 months, but every single day, given the truth that you see or understand to be the case, in this case, the truth that clear boundaries is in zero contradiction or zero conflict with being loving, compassionate, and caring, how can you enact that? Nobody can give you that answer because you need to live the answer in your daily practice, in your experience, and it becomes a living reality that nobody can give you a cookie cutter step-by-step process for, because everybody's different in terms of how they work out the answers to these really important life questions in their daily life. Okay. By the way, I'm speaking to you here in the library at Tantrika Institute Portugal, also known as TIP. I've jokingly decided that our slogan, since Tantrika Institute Portugal is TIP, that our slogan should be on the leading edge of the present moment. TIP. Because I'm silly like that. Yeah, so still here, ready to welcome you guys when you can come. Not really going anywhere, at least not for the foreseeable future. And the good news is that those of you who can't travel, can't visit us here in person, you're going to soon have access to our about to be launched online learning portal, which is very exciting because this has been a long time in the making and still will require many more years to finish. But we're going to launch it with, the plan is sort of to launch it with enough content that by the time you've gone through the content that's there's more content. So we will stay ahead of you, even the most assiduous and dedicated students. We will stay ahead of you for the next 4 years. That's the plan. We'll see if that is successful. But to launch with enough content and enough curriculum that there'll always be more by the time you finish what's there. Until you finish the whole entire curriculum, which we believe would take a few years. Anyway, so that will launch soon. How soon is soon? 2 weeks max. And so that's very exciting. And more, you'll be hearing more about that. Okay, so now going to a question in the question thread from Joya, if I'm saying her name right, Joya Iris Deva. Joya says, longing to share and desiring to grasp are very different in the raw experience of physical sensations prior to mind labeling. But could we say that both come from the belief of being a separate entity, a separate self? If you and I are actually vibrations of and in the same field of wholeness, appearing separate, and both of us fully recognize and dissolve this illusory otherness, what's the point to longing to share? Is it the concealing, revealing play of Shakti? I would say that longing to share does not necessarily arise from experiencing yourself as a separate entity. Um, Depends what kind of longing we're talking about. If it's this sort of edgy, desperate longing, you long to share so that you can be seen, right? Be recognized, be respected. Well, that does come from experiencing yourself as separate, right? Because when we long to be seen and understood and respected and all this stuff, that is because we are experiencing ourselves as separate, and those experiences of being seen, etc., give us a momentary taste of connection, and we want to be connected. In other words, we want to realize our essential, innate, integral wholeness. Okay. Having said that, longing to share could arise while experiencing your essential, innate, integral wholeness, because that could just be life moving through you, right? This longing to share is like there's something that life wants to do through you. I mean, this is the default value for people who abide in essence nature. Only the minority, only a small percentage, just sort of sit there and do nothing, and that's absolutely beautiful. Doing nothing is perfect. But the vast majority of people who abide in essence nature are inspired to do things. Do what things? Anything. Talk to people, garden, hug, coach, rock climb, whatever. Whatever life wants to do through you. So sharing in some way or another, sharing your feelings, sharing your art, sharing your thoughts, that might be a natural flow of life energy. And how would you know? Well, it's actually pretty simple to know, because when you go to share and it's, not appreciated, then it's not the end of the world, right? You might be a little like, oh, I was kind of hoping to connect with some people, with you guys over that. Didn't happen. Okay. It'll happen in some other way at some other moment. That's okay, But if you're longing to share is based in this kind of veiled grasping, this hungry ghost impulse of like, I need recognition, I need to be seen, I need to be understood, I need to be acknowledged, I need to be celebrated, I need to be, the list goes on, right? Then sharing and having that sharing not appreciated is more or less devastating, right? Which shows you right away kind of where it's coming from. So, but longing to share is natural in embodied forms of consciousness that are innately social, right? In our very biology, we are innately social beings. So why would longing to share disappear just because you're recognizing the true nature of reality and abiding in essence nature? Longing to share, we could call it just impulse to share, iccā-śakti. It's beautiful. It's not necessary, right, per se, but it's beautiful, and allow that to express, right? I would say allow it to express as often as it arises, because it's a great way to track your progress out of this contracted ego self, right? Because more and more you'll find that you're okay with your sharing not being acknowledged, celebrated, whatever. And sometimes it is. That's fine. But you put something out there. It lands for somebody or it doesn't. It's not a big deal either way. And in fact, it's perfect. It's perfect when it lands. It's perfect when it doesn't. Nothing should be other than as it is. Hope that makes sense for everyone. I kind of do think that is an important topic. I am seeing I am seeing the comment thread this time. Facebook Live software is working as intended, so I am seeing at least some of the comments in the live comment thread. Okay, Mukti Devi says, can you speak to the controversial behavior misconduct of masters or gurus? This is a question asked frequently, but I'll just touch on it. She says, specifically, I'm in a master's program at Naropa, and it comes up often about Trungpa, Chogyam Trungpa, who had plenty of controversial behavior and what some would call misconduct. Are such masters actually realized, or do they abuse their power, or are they seemingly using their seemingly inappropriate behavior as a teaching? How do we trust our teachers? Like I said, this question is asked a lot, but it's worth answering many times in many different ways, I think. First of all, you can't know whether anyone is realized, and especially not once they're dead. Then you really can't know. You might hear reports from people, oh, no, definitely, Trungpa was a great master, definitely a fully awakened being. Okay, well, what you're hearing about is somebody's experience / belief, and those are very hard to separate, especially in this sort of case. If they're convinced that the person is enlightened, they'll experience them as enlightened. And if they're really convinced, nothing will dispel that experience, even the most egregiously inappropriate behavior. So you can't put any faith or credence in other people's reports of their own experiences and their own beliefs, which are, again, almost never clearly separated. Very few people even know how to do the contemplation that would successfully separate experience from belief. So whatever anyone said, you can't know, and it doesn't really matter. That's the more important point here, you guys, is that it doesn't matter whether person X, Y, or Z is enlightened or realized or liberated. Of course it can't matter, given the fact that you can't know. I mean, if it really mattered on the spiritual path, then there would be ways to know for sure that somebody is fully awakened or whatever you want to call it. But there's not. So it can't matter. What does matter then? Transmission matters. That is to say, what teachings and practices are you able to receive from any given source that are effective for you? Efficacy matters. Okay? If you receive a teaching or practice and it's efficacious, then that's all you need to know. That is the end. You don't need to know anything else, right? If that teaching or practice came from somebody who, some records show, did some egregiously harmful things, that does not cast any doubt or shadow over the teaching or practice itself. Because, I've written this whole article on this, and really I should let the article speak, but I haven't finished it yet. But this is the key thing, is that Shakti, the energy of transmission, right, that inspires us on the path, often in the form of teachings and practices, admits no obstacle. Shakti admits no obstacle. It's a transcendent divine power. You think it would refuse to flow through someone who has some bad behavior? No, it flows through anyone and everyone at any given moment, right? You yourself might be an unwitting vehicle for transmission at a certain moment, right? if you think you are a vehicle, then that often tends to screw it up, right? That spiritual ego temporarily can distort the transmission, right? But on the whole, valid, effective, powerful teachings and practices come through people engaged in sporadically harmful behavior all the time. And if they didn't, we probably wouldn't have 90% of the teachings and practices that we do. Okay? So, in a sense, people are asking the wrong questions around this. And asking the right questions really matters for your spiritual life. Of course, putative realized beings abuse their power all the time, right? And Mukti asks this question: how do we trust our teachers? Well, you can trust everybody to be exactly who they are. Right? The problem is that you don't actually know who they are, meaning to say you don't know what their patterns of behavior are from the outset, right? So when you receive something beautiful from somebody, you're tempted to believe that they are some kind of pure being who doesn't make a misstep, because what you received from them or through them is so exquisitely beautiful and powerful that you then idealize them into this person who doesn't harm anyone or doesn't make a misstep. I think you'd be much better off assuming the opposite. That which is beautiful and powerful and efficacious can and does frequently come through someone who's perfectly capable of making missteps and does so maybe even every single day. If you just assume that that's the case, then you're in a much safer position, right? Because people can't abuse their power unless we let them abuse their power, right? So we have a responsibility as well. Of course, you can say, but the people who have more power in a power differential have more responsibility. That is a wonderful idea. It just doesn't seem to work out in real life, right? Because we can go around all day long from morning till night saying with great power comes great responsibility, and people are still going to abuse their power. So, given that fact, the buck stops with you, that you take care of yourself. And you assume that anyone could fall victim to spiritual ego at any time. Of course, the teachings say if they're fully awakened, they can't fall victim to spiritual ego because they have no ego to become corrupted, But since you can't know who's awakened and who's realized, since that's an impossible thing to know about another person, therefore, you should assume that anyone might fall victim to spiritualized ego at any time. Spiritualized ego is the kind of ego that looks shiny and pretty, so you don't realize it's ego on the surface. Now, this may not be the case. It may be the case that that person conducts themselves with near perfect integrity, but there's no harm in presuming that they might make a serious misstep at any moment. And it doesn't stop you loving them either, right? Don't you love your kids and your partners and whoever else, even though you know they might make a serious misstep at every moment? I sure hope so. It's not real love otherwise. So love your teachers, knowing that they could make a serious misstep at any moment. And if you're really lucky, they do so only infrequently. But well, actually, what does luck have to do with it? It only has to do with the fact that if your teachers conduct themselves with a reasonable amount of integrity, then you don't have to, grapple with a whole kind of process of disillusionment in order to salvage the valuable teachings and practices that you've received from them. A lot of people do have to grapple with that, and that's okay. That's part of the process, right? But Mukti Devi says, is it possible that, an awakened teacher uses their seemingly inappropriate behavior as a teaching? Whether it's possible or not, I think you should presume that it's almost always an excuse. And it's an excuse that not only the teacher makes for themselves, but much more often the students of the teacher who have investment, material and immaterial investment in that teacher and that teacher's organization, will make that excuse for the teacher. And it's dangerous, because it can be used to justify any kind of behavior. So I don't see any value to presuming the inappropriate behavior is actually a transcendental teaching, even though I allow that it's possible. I think you're on dangerous ground if you assume that's the case about anyone. Okay, so this also covers what somebody was asking in the question thread. It was Felipe who was also asking about this. So I think that answered both questions in one. Now we have a bunch of questions appearing in the live thread. This is usually why I can't get to all the questions, but that's okay. Jana says, I wonder if you can say a few words about depression. It visits me from time to time, and this time is quite debilitating, and I find it hard to be with. I still don't know if I should dive into it or try to focus on other things and distract myself, or just keep on doing my spiritual practices and daily life while feeling depressed. I wouldn't say dive into it exactly, maybe dive into it as a near enemy to radical acceptance of what is. As strange as it may seem to some people, there has to be radical acceptance of yourself and your depression if you're ever going to find peace with it. It may be the case, and it is the case for some people, that if they radically accept themselves and their depression, that it starts visiting less frequently. But it may not be the case, and you certainly can't, practice radical acceptance on hoping that it will solve the problem, because then it's not radical acceptance, is it? It's not really different from anything else. When you're depressed, it can seem like it's different from other things, right? Somebody who who fights in a war or, loses a limb, right? Practicing total acceptance of their new situation, which some are able to do and some aren't, but the spiritual path certainly advises, right? Acceptance of the fact of a missing limb and acceptance of the presence of something like depression are not fundamentally different. It's just acceptance of what is. So, sounds crazy, but you say to depression, stay as long as you like and go as soon as you're ready. Just as you say to every single emotion and every single mental emotional state. Stay as long as you like and go as soon as you're ready. Caveat, however, is while you are practicing moment-to-moment acceptance, you also can avail yourself of various modalities to work with the condition. whether the condition is depression or anything else, unresolved trauma, whatever. You can go to a therapist. You can go to, a specialist in somatic therapy, right, which I tend to recommend above talk therapy, especially for things like depression. So somatic experiencing, trauma release exercises, this kind of stuff, it's great. But here's the thing. You can do all that with the attitude that it just feels like the right thing to do to care for yourself by applying these different modalities, not with the attitude of there's a problem to be solved, there's something wrong with me. If there's something wrong with you, there's something wrong with everyone. And doesn't it make more sense to say that actually there's nothing wrong with anyone? This is just the human condition. We all have something. Maybe for you it's depression, for someone else it's something else. We all have something. This is like I find it astonishing that this is not like a central message that goes out to all young people, like that most people are pretending to be highly functional, and maybe they are highly functional, but still something fucks them up. Something keeps them awake at night sometimes. We all have something. We literally all have something. Doesn't matter how functional you appear. And the fact of being better at appearing functional isn't itself a virtue. Okay? So given that fact that we all have something, what if we just presume that the universe didn't make us wrong? That therefore this is indeed the normal and correct human condition, that we all have something that we struggle with, except you don't have to struggle with it anymore. You can just be with it and work with the modalities that seem appropriate to you in order to be with it more successfully, right? Because again, you can go to a therapist not with this attitude of there's something wrong with me that needs to be fixed, but I want to befriend my embodiment more fully. If depression is part of my embodiment, I want to make friends with it. Maybe it means depression will happen less often, maybe not. But either way, there's no harm in befriending that which visits you. That's simple. Befriend that which visits you, whether it's depression or something else. Anxiety, doesn't matter. How do you befriend it? Well, that's the question, isn't it? Pursue every modality that might help you befriend it until you have succeeded in befriending it, So this is what I want to invite, and this applies to so many people, almost everyone, I'm sure. Practice radical acceptance of what is, radical acceptance of yourself with your thing or multiple things. You might think, oh, some people have one thing, I have multiple things. It just depends how you're looking at it, Please don't tell the story that your suffering is especially bad. There's no benefit to telling that story, and it's not actually true. I know it seems to be true sometimes, but that's only because you're convinced of it already. It's not because there's sufficient evidence to believe that. Okay? Okay, so radical acceptance of what is, radical acceptance of yourself with whatever your thing is or things are, and also exploring modalities. Because you care enough to do that, because you love yourself enough, even if it's just enough, just barely enough. Love yourself just barely enough to try some things that help you befriend your embodiment, which includes all your mental states, that's part of embodiment, more fully. So good. That's I like a Q&A where something gets said where the whole Q&A is worthwhile, feels worthwhile just for that one topic, even though the others are also valuable. Okay, one more thing in the live feed. Dila, may or may not be saying this name right. Dila says, when we're interacting with others, the comments we make or actions we take may not land for them well, despite the fact that it's not our intention to cause harm. If we're aware of their tendency to not receive our comments or actions well, or we notice that our comments or actions have not landed well, what is our responsibility here? This is a great question. I would say, number one, you're not responsible for anyone else's inner state. But number two, maybe, if you're human, you have some compassion, right, in there somewhere. It's okay if you don't feel it in any given moment. You can't be feeling compassion all the damn time, okay? Nobody can do that. Not the Buddha, not the Dalai Lama. Nobody feels compassion every moment of every day in relation to every person. But you might have access to some compassion at that moment, and whether you do or not is not within your control, so don't blame yourself. But you might. And if you do, then why not just say, oh, hey, I saw that didn't land for you well. I could see that in your face. Correct me if I'm wrong. I just want to apologize because, I was, the place I was offering it from was something like this, and I see it landed for you in a different way. And, that's okay. But I just wanted to, acknowledge that. Acknowledge it, apologize if that feels, but apology doesn't mean you did something wrong. If you can really get that through your head, that'll be helpful too. You're not admitting to wrongdoing when you apologize. You're saying, I sympathize with you, or I empathize with you. I see, oh, that didn't land for you very well. Oh, I'm sorry, meaning, oh, I wish it had landed better for you. And I care about what you're experiencing, right? I'm sorry can mean different things. If you don't have access to that compassion in that moment, that's fine, because you aren't responsible for somebody else's inner state. Stuff is going to land wrong for them. You can't go around, trying to manage other people's perceptions, right? But again, it's also good to notice the unintentional impact of your words and actions, and notice it without self-blame, without self-judgment. And some people say, how could I do it without self-judgment? Well, perhaps by realizing that this is, again, the nature of reality, you're always going to cause periodic or sporadic unintentional harm. If that was wrong, it wouldn't be possible. It's not only possible, it always happens. So it must be part of the nature of reality that is not only okay, but exactly as it should be. Right? This is how we as human beings grow, through friction, through misunderstandings, through the contemplations that those engender. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you should go around, thoughtlessly. Just saying, there doesn't need to be a single iota of self-judgment, self-blame, or self-hatred to acknowledge that the impact of your action might have been harmful in the sense of how it was received by the other person, right? Actions are not intrinsically harmful, by and large. We can say actions are not intrinsically harmful, but any action can land in a painful way for anyone else, right? And then we notice what we do as humans. We immediately try to excuse ourselves by saying, oh, I didn't mean that. That's not the fucking point, okay? Because look, if of course you didn't mean it, 99% of the time, sure, maybe 1% of the time, you're just so angry that you're just really mean to hurt someone, right? But usually you don't mean it, and that's not the point. Impact matters more than intention if we're going to grow towards harmony as a human society, right? It may seem like a far-off possibility currently, but it's still a possibility. And if we're going to move towards harmony as a human society, we have to acknowledge that interpersonally, impact matters more than intention. So you don't get off the hook by saying, I didn't mean that, I didn't mean to hurt you. You need to look at why. Why was your action, why did it land in that way? Sure, the reason might be because the other person is super traumatized and they take everything in the worst possible way. But that doesn't mean that you're off the hook for at least a moment of contemplation. Oh, wow, this action can land this way for a traumatized person. I didn't know that. Let me get clear on this in myself. Doesn't even necessarily mean you need to change your behavior, but it's good to know how things land for people and how things land for traumatized people. Right? So I think that's a great contemplation and a great kind of question to explore, and that's the rapid sort of capsule summary of my response for your contemplation. Alexander has a long question in the live feed. I want to get to more of the questions written in advance. So I'm not going to try to grapple with this other than the last question Alexander puts in his paragraph. He says, I would love to hear you speak on the influence of Śaiva Tantra on Tibetan Buddhist Tantra in its current form. Have you written about that? No, not really. I haven't really written about that, but a lot of people have. Alexis Sanderson, among others, has shown that Śaiva Tantra, which was not a Kashmiri phenomenon, by the way, it was a pan-Indian phenomenon. The most famous authors of Śaiva Tantra happen to have lived in Kashmir for various reasons, that being a kind of very productive literary culture for a time with a lot of patronage, but the tradition of Śaiva Tantra was pan-Indian. It was not localized to Kashmir. Its influence on Buddhism was huge because Tantra appears first in Shaivism and within a century or so is wholesale adopted by Buddhism, meaning tantric practices. I'm not talking about Buddhists adopting Shaiva philosophy. Indeed, in the philosophical side, it was more the other way around. Shaivas were influenced by Buddhist philosophy. They really took seriously their Buddhist interlocutors, and they formulated their philosophical arguments very much in dialogue with their Buddhist contemporaries. But on the level of practice, the direction of influence very much goes the other way. We see Shaiva tantric practices appearing in Buddhism often exactly the same as they appear in the Shaiva sources. We even see countless examples of Buddhists in the medieval period, copying Shaiva texts and just changing a couple words, changing the word Shiva to the word Buddha, for example, and otherwise copying word for word from Shaiva sources. Sanderson has proved that abundantly with hundreds of pages of evidence, such as in his monumental article, The Shaiva Age. That's a very overwhelming piece of academic work to read, but you can read a much shorter thing called Vajrayana, Origin and Function by Sanderson. And indeed, Buddhists really don't like to hear this, but it's now abundantly proven that tantric practice originated in Shaivism and was imported into Buddhism almost whole cloth and then modified within Buddhism, right? So they did end up with plenty of different practices and revelations on the Buddhist side on the basis of a wholesale importation in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. Sort of an academic question, but I like mentioning that. I like things that rankle people a little, I guess. Okay, back to the original question thread, the questions that were written beforehand. Chris says, I find myself drawn to deity yoga, but I've never been initiated into those kinds of practices. I've only been initiated into Kriya yoga practices. I think he means Paramahansa Yogananda Kriya Yoga. There's many kinds of Kriya Yoga. Chris says, can deity yoga bear fruit without being initiated into the practices? And if not, will the new Tantrika 7 Facets curriculum, which includes a track on deity yoga, include any kind of initiation into those kinds of practices? Traditionally, you do need initiation to undertake deity yoga. I don't know what's going to happen with the Tantrika online curriculum deity yoga facet if we're just going to educate people about deity yoga and give some basic practices that don't require initiation, or if indeed at some point there will be some sort of initiatory thing that will give you access to further, more advanced deity yoga practices. I can't really say at this point how that will play out. But yeah, that's a good example of the sort of practice that indeed initiation is traditionally required for, deity yoga, and other practices not so much. We'll see. That might maybe not a satisfying answer, but we'll see what happens. And I understand that it's a problematic issue because there are very few people around, offering very few trustworthy people around offering that kind of initiation that will give you access to those practices. I don't have there's certainly no easy answer to that question. Can we see if the power cable can reach over here for the MacBook? Tom says, is this realm of karma in a physical body the only place our karma can be worked out? Answer, no. Is this the only realm in which we can shed our samskaras? Answer, no. And I'm just answering, on the basis of the traditional teachings, right? The whole point to there being heavenly realms and hellish realms is because they're kind of karmic clearinghouses. You work off a hell of a lot of good karma in a heavenly realm, and you work off a hell of a lot of bad karma in a hellish realm. That indeed is the whole point. But then these are questions that I don't find particularly interesting, by the way, but I'm giving the traditional answers. Tom says, is this earth plane the only realm that we evolve in? I take issue with the use of the word evolve. But if Tom means, is this the only realm in which we can awaken to our true nature? The answer is no, but it's by far the easiest. So in heavenly realms, traditional teaching, you're too busy enjoying heavenly pleasures. It's like you are seriously handicapped when it comes to realizing essence nature. When you're in hellish realms working off that karma, well then that's the distraction. You're too busy occupied with your own pain, right? And by the way, this tradition, that even though it talks about heavenly and hellish realms, is very different from, say, Christianity. Because the idea here isn't that you go to heaven or go to hell when you die, as if that's a permanent destination. You go to both, actually. Not everyone, but the idea as taught in the Mahabharata, if you read the end of the story of the Mahabharata, right, that first people go to hellish realms to work off, a chunk of their so-called bad karma, papa karma, and then they go to heavenly realms and work off a chunk of their punya karma, and then they come back to earth. That's the sort of traditional idea about this. Now, it's possible to awaken in other realms, but it's just very, very unlikely. So Earth is the place to be. If you want to awaken to your essence nature. Not always fun to be here, but it's relatively balanced compared to many other realms. Again, I'm not claiming that these answers are the truth with a capital T. I'm telling you what the tradition says about it. KL, Nada, and Cameron ask personal questions, such as, how's your own process of awakening / liberation unfolding? Very well, thank you. What are you noticing at the moment? At the moment, doesn't feel like the right question exactly, because it doesn't really change moment to moment. Changes more sort of glacially, I would say. Let me answer it this way. What do I enjoy noticing at this point in my spiritual practice? That's easier to answer. I enjoy noticing spacious openness, quiet presence, perfect clarity, joyful embodiment, everything perfectly fitting into everything else. Kind of hard to put words to that. The pattern, I suppose. I enjoy noticing the pattern and being the pattern, feeling the pattern. The play of consciousness. The sense of humor of the goddess. Playfulness. The absolute meaninglessness of everything. The absolute meaningfulness of everything. That's a short list. That's enough for now, maybe. I don't, of course, mean to suggest or imply that I notice these qualities of reality constantly. But thankfully, I notice them whenever I care to look or remember to look, which is every day, but it's not all the time. And that to me, that's like, I feel the possibility of abiding in that clear perception or awakeness all the time, but I don't really need it. I don't really feel like I need it. It feels like enough fruit of practice. Like practice has borne its fruit so beautifully and abundantly just to be here at this kind of juncture where, like I said, those qualities of reality are there whenever I bother to notice them or care to notice them, and it's just a matter of slowing down for a minute and looking, and there they are, one or more of those qualities of reality. Wonderful, Do I perfectly embody those qualities of reality in my conduct? No. Is that okay? Yes. I hope you can be okay with it too. It's nice to invite more and more embodiment, but I'm not in control of whether that happens or not. That's okay. Then Kale Nada says, how does it feel being expected to know or answer innumerable questions on all aspects of Tantra view, practice, and fruits. It feels fine because I don't think I should have all the answers, so I don't feel upset about not having all the answers. But I think there's a subtext to this question, which is he or she or they is saying, is sort of asking if, do I feel put off by the fact that sometimes people over-idealize me as they over-idealize any and every teacher and imagine that I have more answers than I do? Sometimes that feels kind of uncomfortable or awkward or like, I don't even know how to describe the state. But when people don't realize that the majority of the answers come from within, that of course, like, we need teachers, and there are those people who go too far the other way and say, oh, all the answers come from within. Well, if that was true, the world would be primarily full of enlightened people. But the majority of answers come from within when you slow down, get quiet, and listen. But we need teachers to confirm our intuitions. We need teachers to answer those things that are just out of sight for us for some reason, blind spots, we don't take those answers on blind faith, of course. The teacher offers an answer. It's for you to check in your direct experience. But you have something to check. That's valuable. You receive an answer, you check it in your direct experience and see if it turns out to be true when you look carefully, right? But yeah, when people are kind of seem to be abiding in a state where they think most of the answers need to be procured from outside themselves by reading the right book and going to the right workshop and finding the right teachers and asking the right questions, that's uncomfortable for them, and it's uncomfortable for their teachers sometimes. Other times it's fine because that's how things are. I like when it's fine. But even so, yeah, sometimes I get uncomfortable with that compulsive looking outside oneself. I invite a balance. Look within, look without. The truth should be found everywhere you look. So don't just look one place. And then Kale Nada says, what's the number one misapprehension you see practitioners struggle with on the path? Well, that's a tough one. Nobody ever asked this in recent memory anyway. Maybe I'll go for like top 3. I don't know. One of the top misapprehensions, that awakeness or enlightenment, or call it whatever you want, is something to be attained. No matter how many times the teachers say it's not something to be attained, it's what you already are, people still act in every possible way like it's something to be attained. If you really realize that it's not something to be attained, it does change your whole relationship to practice. Right? It's less like struggling to up to some mountaintop, and it's more like relaxing into that which you already are and always were. And so practice becomes more sweet. Sometimes, what's accessible is what's accessible. When you go to relax into what you fundamentally are, it happens or it doesn't. It happens halfway or all the way. But you just keep doing that. You just keep inviting that relaxation into what you are, not what you think you are. And you keep orienting to the possibility of seeing the difference between those two. And it's not an easy thing to do, because your thoughts about what you are get increasingly subtle as you walk the path. So discerning the difference between your thoughts about what you are and what you actually are is a very, very subtle thing if you've been on the spiritual path, for some time or any time. But you just increasingly orient it to that possibility and relax into being. That's the kind of mode of practice when you really see and feel and sense that it's really true that the goal of the path is not something to be attained. And this misapprehension is constantly reinforced, of course, by language of attainment. We see it even in translations of scriptural texts, language of attainment. That really messes us up. So, don't blame you for having that misapprehension, but please be free of it as soon as possible. Okay, so there's other misapprehensions, but we'll let that be the number one for today. Cameron asks another very difficult question. I don't know if I can answer it, but he says, could you narrow down one aspect regarding your experience with Śaiva Tantra that has propelled your own sadhana, be it the overall view or a particular practice? If you were to whittle down the main catalyst within this wonderful tradition, what would it be? Okay, so implicit in the question is, what's the one indispensable practice? Tell me so I can do it and save some time, because this is complicated. It's a big tradition with lots of practices. Right? So, of course, there's no answer to that, because whatever is most effective for me might not be most effective for you. Right? And any sane teacher in this tradition or any other who hears the question, what's the best practice, is going to answer the question with another question, for whom and when. And if they don't, that I wouldn't necessarily trust that teacher, because there is no one practice that's the best practice for everyone all the time, of course. And I think Cameron knows this. I'm just making it clear. But if I had to choose sort of what is the teaching / practice that's been most impactful, and it is a matter sometimes of teaching / practice. The best teachings are also practices, and the best practices are also teachings. So I would say Chinmatra, consciousness only. The teaching, which also invites a practice and a contemplation, that everything is consciousness and consciousness is everything. Exploring the implications and ramifications of that has been the primary engine for me in the awakening process, and seems to be inexhaustible in its power. But it might not be the primary engine for you. I was thinking maybe we end there. There's more good questions. Julia says, there are teachers who fervently claim that the goal is something to be attained. Is that what you mean? Who fervently claim it's something to be attained, also teachers of Tantra. Can you explain this? No, I can't. I have no explanation for why people spout nonsense. I mean, presumably they believe it's perfectly true, that the goal of the path is somehow something to be attained. I would say yes. There are you can position some to be attained things as goals. You can position attainables as goals, but why bother unless it's just for the fun of it, right? We play board games, we play games, and you try to get to the finish before the other players. Why? For the fun of it, it's just for fun. It's not for any reason. So if you position an attainable thing as a goal, you should be very clear, it's just for fun. And maybe it prompts some self-cultivation too. Like if an athlete wants to be the first one over the finish line, he or she's got to train. And that self-cultivation might be beneficial, right? But as Abhinavagupta says, that which is most worthy of realization cannot be an attainable. It has to be an aspect of the already existent nature of reality, because every attainable is impermanent by definition. This should be abundantly clear. This should be taught in Spirituality 101, or Life 101. Anything attainable is impermanent. So that which is most worthy of realization has got to be an aspect of the fundamental nature of reality which doesn't come and go, right? Because then you found something that you can really, what would be the metaphor? Build your house on, like stake your life on. No point in staking your life on something impermanent, right? Some of the Buddhists are going to say, well, everything's impermanent. Well, but that's one of the distinguishing features. We don't say that. Right? The formless ground of being, whether you call it awareness, presence, or something else, is not impermanent. It doesn't come and go. And it's possible for something formless to be permanent. But everything with form is impermanent. We can agree on that. Mark says, but what about the word labhe in the Recognition Sutras? Okay, the vast majority, if not everything, said in spiritual discourse is a figure of speech. Okay, so when we're talking about relative truth, there can be statements that are literally true. But when we're talking about absolute truth, everything we say in words is a figure of speech. Which figure of speech do you use? It doesn't matter except pedagogically, relative to your audience. Why did Kshemarajya use a word that means attain? We don't know we don't know the psychological states of his original audience and why he pedagogically chose that word, but it's a figure of speech. That much I can assure you about, that when he says attain, right, like Chidananda labhe, attaining the bliss of realization, it means the exact same thing as if I say realize the inherent joy of consciousness. Okay, so attain can refer to the fact that experientially speaking, you didn't have it in your experience before, and now you have it in your experience. But notice, the word notice refers to the exact same thing. You didn't have it in your experience before, now you do. Right? So do you see what I mean? The same words can point to different things. So, Chidananda labhe, example of what Marc is talking about in the Recognition Sutras, and Marc is one of the leaders of our Recognition Sutras book club. That's why he's on it with the exact words. Chidananda labhe, the attainment of the bliss of consciousness, means the exact same thing as realizing the joy inherent to consciousness. Okay, back over to the question thread. Jenny says, why is it imperative not to move a muscle, even if a fly crawls up your nose during yoga nidrā? Right, that's a thing that we say. In yoga nidrā, you don't move a muscle, whether a fly crawls up your nose or anything else happens, Now, that you could take that example as hyperbole if you want, right? Although in the tradition, it's very much a thing, right? There's this meditator, there's this story of this meditator who was so badass that he stayed absolutely still in meditation as this particular kind of burrowing worm burrowed into his thigh, and then the guru was like, you have done well, my son. I think it's a hyperbolic story, but it is making the point. And what point is it making? If you are always making little adjustments, then you are reinforcing body identification. You need to go beyond body identification in meditation and in yoga nidra. Now, how important is it in yoga nidra versus meditation? I don't know, but in meditation in general, it's really important to learn how to go beyond body identification. And for most people, you can't do that when you're always doing stuff with your body. Now, that's kind of opens up a whole can of worms about free will and stuff like that. But the point is, become still, stop moving, and stop even believing you could move. And that can help you go beyond body identification to something deeper. You can't really access the subtle dimensions of being if you're strongly body identified, let alone exclusively body identified, as many humans are. So this helps us to go beyond that, this stillness practice. Okay, maybe 1-2 more questions. Lisa says, regarding freedom of choice, do we choose to which family we are born? Do we choose where and when and to whom we are born? No. Is it determined by karma? Yes, mostly. Those are the traditional answers. Not going to elaborate on that. But it's certainly important to know that these South Asian traditions do not agree with modern New Age spirituality on this point. You don't choose to whom you're born. You are compelled to take birth where and when you do because of your karma and your samskaras. I'm not going to say more. I'm going to cut myself off. Nikolai says, thinking about the 5 acts, Panchakritya, I was wondering what happens with all the awakened and liberated beings during the next Kalpa. Is there another contraction for them, or are they forever beyond that? This question illustrates an important misunderstanding. Fully awakened and liberated beings are no more. They're not individuals, So like, there's no reincarnation for such a being, because if the way I put it is, if a drop has merged into the ocean and you go to pick out that drop again, well, pick any drop, right? Okay, that's another potentially big topic. I'm going to cut myself off so we can get to this last question from David. Hang on, give me a second. This is too deep of a question to answer now. David, I think you're a patron as well on Patreon, right? Maybe we can get into this next week on the Patreon call. This question around Pratibhā. Talking to David Hodgson here. Sorry, there's like 100 Davids in the group. David says his friend believes Pratibhā is best defined as the quiet voice of the inner self or inner guru that is continually whispering to and guiding the seeker from within. It is that. Pratibhā is that, but it's not just that. And we use the word whispering here as a figure of speech again, because Pratibhā is non-conceptual and non-verbal. This inner intuitive sense, this inner intuitive insight is non-conceptual and non-verbal, so it doesn't speak in words, with very rare exceptions, because for some reason there has to always be an exception to every rule in life, right? But 99.99% of the time, Pratibhā, intuitive insight, does not speak in words. It's non-conceptual and non-verbal, outside the mind. Anyway, big topic. Let's get into it more next week. Okay, good. Got through a lot here. A lot of good stuff. So my friend Mark, who helps to run, he's not the only person, but he helps to run the Recognition Sutras book club and Tantra Illuminated book club. And I'll do a little shout out to Mark because he's a great spiritual practitioner and also a martial arts master, a jiu-jitsu master. And he wrote a book on inner jiu-jitsu, which is the spiritual philosophy that corresponds to these martial arts. So little shout out to him there for that. He didn't ask me to do a shout out, which makes it quite a bit more likely. So yeah, check out Mark's work if you're into that. Marc Genco. Jay Shraddha says, wow, that's a relief that I didn't choose my parents. Thank you. Well, exactly the point. That's what's kind of horrible about the New Age teaching, is that it kind of makes everything your fault, you know? No, it's not everything is your fault, for God's sake. In fact, virtually nothing is, because everything happens due to everything. Anyway, but no, you didn't choose your parents. You got to deal with, you got to digest the experiences. That's up to you. You do got to digest the experiences you've had with your parents, but you didn't choose them. Okay, so thank you all. Nice Q&A. If you want more, join the Patreon group, and we'll do another Q&A next week on Patreon. It's a little smaller, more focused. Patreon.com/Hareesh. Also, stay tuned in the next 10 to 14 days for the grand opening, unveiling, launch of Tantrika Online, our new learning portal with our new curriculum, again in its nascent form, in its seed form, but we are launching with 3 of the 7 facets, or at least the first course of 3 of the 7 facets, and more. So please do check that out. That's exciting. And it'll take quite some time, but over the next 5 months or so, we will migrate this community onto our own platform that we collectively care for and collectively build and participate in. And certainly for those who sign up for the monthly membership on the new platform, all that money is going to be plowed right back into the platform for your benefit. So this is really, I'm serious when I say we're going to collectively build this platform together. Because even if you're on one of the paid membership tiers, that's all going to go to build the platform more effectively over the next few years. And where our goal is, again, to migrate the community off these potentially harmful social media platforms that have contributed to our current state of society, in which our information ecosystems are polluted, highly polluted with misinformation and disinformation. I was just listening to a wonderful podcast on this subject by the brilliant author Nina Schick. Anyway, hugely important problem today, and because it's affecting our politics, our society, our culture, our attitude to other demographic groups, our attitude to the issues of immigration and everything else, massively affected by misinformation and disinformation, including that's actively sown by people who are trying to fragment our societies through social media. So we want to for many other reasons as well. We want to transition our community off Facebook, off YouTube, off harmful social media platforms, which may rehabilitate themselves over the next 2 years, but they do not show signs of it yet. And we will have our own virtual space that we all build together. Om. Nice to be with you. See you next time.